Hello, everybody. Welcome. We're doing a demo debate on the January public forum topic. The debaters on the affirmative will be myself, Conrad Palor, and Alyssa McCartan speaking first. And then on the negative, it'll be Yukio Simomoto and Arnab Sarkar. So with that said, the affirmative will be speaking first.
All right, are you all ready? We affirm resolved, the National Security Agency should end its surveillance of U.S. citizens and lawful permanent residents. Contention 1 is fighting terrorism. Curtailing domestic surveillance helps aid in the fight against terrorism, and this is true for 2 reasons. Subpoint A is information overload. Mass surveillance decimates effective counterterrorism, and data mining is the wrong tool. Bruce Schneier writes in 2019 that the NSA justifies surveillance in the name of security, but oftentimes have to sort through millions of innocent people who did no wrong. This is due to error rates. Finding terrorists requires a higher degree of accuracy than data mining systems can provide. Each alert of wrongdoing requires a lengthy investigation that takes time and money and prevents officers from doing other productive work. Consequently, systems are often flooded with false alarms that are useless and overwhelm the system to the point where he concludes that ubiquitous surveillance is the wrong tool for fighting terrorism. The impact is twofold. First, the economy. Thomas Claiborne explains in 2009 that the information overload cost the U.S. economy $900 billion annually with no measurable effect on fighting poverty. Second is trading off with more effective measures. Priest and Arklin explained in 2010 that the information overload creates redundancy and make it impossible to fight against terrorist attacks. Fortunately, ending domestic surveillance against U.S. citizens ends the overflow of information into NSA databases and frees decision makers to allocate resources to more effective means of combating terrorism. Massive amounts of data are collected each and every year from U.S. citizens that floods the system with false positives. Subpoint B is European cooperation. Consequently, Mix continues that in 2015, NSA surveillance hinders the United States' relationship with European allies as they have concerned with the overreach of surveillance onto private citizens. Fortunately, ending surveillance programs is key to incentivizing cooperation, as Lister finds in 2013 that the perception alone of restoring oversight and protecting individuals' privacy is enough to resolve Europe's concerns and incentivize cooperation. The impact to European cooperation is fighting terrorism. Proptopoptas writes in 2014 that the intelligence sharing between the US and European allies increases the possibilities of effective identification and prevention of terrorism. Contention 2 is privacy. Indiscriminate mass surveillance erodes privacy rights and violates the Constitution. According to CINA 14, the United States government today is implementing a wide variety of surveillance programs that, thanks to the developments of technological capacities, have allowed it to scoop up personal information and content of personal communications to an unprecedented scale. He furthers that constitutional law sets limits on the state's authority to engage in surveillance, which has the potential to undermine so many other rights. The current large-scale, often indiscriminate U.S. approach to surveillance has enormous costs. It erodes global digital privacy and sets a terrible example for other countries. A report from ProPublica found that a record of calls made in U.S., including telephone numbers and telephone number calls and receiving and information about who was receiving the call and how long calls lasted, have been collected. Facebook has revealed that in the last 6 months of 2012, they handed over privacy data between 18 and 19,000 users to law enforcement of all types. The massive amounts of raw data the NSA collects has been stored and billions of communications records per day are stored in their databases. Analysts can see nearly everything a user does on the internet, including emails and social media posts. Privacy infringements cause 2 major impacts. The first is it challenges free speech. Richard Awashu finds that meaningful freedom of speech requires intellectual privacy. He explains that a society with open communication but no privacy rights is a society without authentic freedom of speech. He furthers that the core of intellectual privacy is the freedom of thought and belief, and the freedom to think and as we believe is important, but can only come about if we have intellectual privacy. Second is privacy is a fundamental human right. Schreiner of the Berkman Center explains that privacy is an inherent human right and a requirement for maintaining the human condition with dignity and respect. He explains that it is the intrinsic concept of liberty because we are all observed in matters, and when we are constantly under the threat of correction judgment, we correct ourselves and we minimize our own uniqueness. For these reasons, we urge you to affirm.
Awesome. Is everyone ready for the negative case? Cool. As a disclaimer, this case does have brief non-graphic mentions of anti-Black violence. Awesome. We negate the resolve that the National Security Agency should end its surveillance of US citizens and lawful permanent citizens. We observe that we should be prioritizing impacts to communities of color first, because MEMI 2K explains that racism intergenerationally impacts minority groups by endorsing fear, injustice, and violence, signifying the exclusion of certain groups. Our sole contention concerns right-wing terrorism. Currently, broad NSA surveillance has been crucial to preventing domestic terrorist attacks, as Lewis of the CSIS 14 corroborates that surveillance is an intelligence tool. There's no replacement for it, and broad surveillance is the least intrusive and most effective method for discovering terrorist activity. Brown of the CSIS 20 confirms that domestic terrorism could persist in the US for the foreseeable future. The US has endured white supremacist terrorism in the 1950s and serious threats from jihadists after 2001, but weathered these periods due to the effectiveness of NSA and US intelligence. In the past, NSA surveillance has pigeonholed on Islamic terror, but recently has switched to countering right-wing terrorism. As Lee 15 writes, that federal counterterrorism programs since 9/11 have focused overwhelmingly on the perceived threat from Islamic extremism, but the attack in Charleston underscored the failure of the federal government to keep closer tabs on right-wing extremists. Fortunately, the focus may be increasing to counter an intelligence assessment that focused on the domestic terror threat posed by right-wing extremists, and a handout from a training program sponsored by the Department of Justice confirmed that the threat from anti-government extremism is real. It's only getting better, as status quo tech investment has solved any past inefficiencies with data collection, as Burkhardt of UIUC in 2014 writes that the White House announced the National Big Data Research and Development Initiative with a budget of over $200 million. This initiative will advance state-of-the-art core technologies needed to collect, store, preserve, manage, analyze, and share huge quantities of data. Unfortunately, ending NSA surveillance would kill domestic counterterrorist operations. Current surveillance is successful at detecting ongoing domestic threats, as Hines of Quartz 13 writes that the NSA surveillance program have provided critical leads to help prevent terrorist events. Terrorist attacks are not orchestrated overnight. They take months or years to plan, and metadata might be the only source of information that captures the sequence of events leading up to an attack. Phone numbers and IP addresses serve as a proxy for the general location of where the planning has taken place. This ability to narrow down the location of terrorists can determine whether there is a domestic threat. Metadata can provide all of this information without ever exposing the content of a phone call or email. If the metadata reveals the suspect is engaged in terrorist activities, then a warrant would allow officials to actually monitor the content of the suspect's communication. Collecting mass amounts of data is key to streamlining the process of tracking down domestic threats, as Lake 14 explains that the storage of the phone records will allow NSA analysts to collect phone numbers of suspected domestic terrorists and saves work by ruling out suspicious numbers quickly. This is why every piece of collected data is useful. Lewis of the CSIS in 2014 corroborates that arguments that collection of data is useless because it has not by itself prevented attack reflect unfamiliarity with the nature of intelligence. Success of intelligence is the efforts of many agencies working to assemble fragments of data. A collection program contributes by not what it reveals, but what it lets us reject as false. Restricting metadata will make it harder to identify attacks and increase the time it takes to respond to domestic threats. For this reason, NSA surveillance has been key to identifying domestic threats, and Joyce of the HDSL 14 quantifies that the NSA has produced a chart which shows the terrorist events disrupted based on NSA programs, specifically 13 in the United States. The impact is fueling racialized violence, as the New York Times in 2015 reports that right-wing extremists are the biggest threat we face in extremism, averaging 337 attacks a year, and are the leading source of ideological violence in the US. These groups threaten people of color, as Craven 15 writes that right-wing extremist groups threaten the people of color in this country through lynching and extreme violence, concluding that this type of anti-Black terrorism is still an ongoing concern. Thus, we negate.
I'm muted, sorry. So the Joyce card that you read towards the end of your case, is that specific to right-wing like terrorist incidents? Or is it just terrorist incidents?
Remind me of the content of the card.
It's right before your impact, where you talk about like the amount of terrorist events that's been like intercepted.
Yeah, that's about general terrorist events. Okay, let's talk about your first contention about terrorism. So you talk about more effective programs that we could be pursuing instead to counter terrorism. What might that look like in terms of examples?
Well, so what we say is like the metadata that you all are referring to takes in too much information for like agents to be able to actually get anything worthwhile, like any leads worth pursuing. So as a result of that, indiscriminate surveillance types that we've seen as a result of like the post 9/11 like government surveillance culture has totally been counterproductive for terrorism.
Okay. So like an alternative would be taking in less data is what y'all would
I mean, yeah, but I would also say like what we are against is the indiscriminate surveillance of Americans, which is the problem.
Sure.
Could I ask you a question?
Yes, of course, absolutely.
Okay, so when we're great. So when we're talking about the like domestic, or when we're talking about like right-wing terrorists specifically, when like, can you give a little bit more context into like when this data is pieced together, what exactly are federal agents doing to preempt the like right-wing movements?
They're able
like
to,
what type of terrorist incidents?
We're talking about any type of terrorist incident that incites violence. When we use the metadata, we are able to tell like what might happen and who are involved in these kind of like issues. So it prevents things like long-term right-wing terrorism if we are able to break apart like specific terrorist groups and extremist violence and stuff like that. So yeah, solvency on that regard.
So in your case, you mentioned like how there's been sort of like a paradigmatic shift after like the Charleston shooting. Are you saying that that is when our surveillance changed to be more like targeted for right-wing terrorist groups rather than Islamic terrorist groups?
Yes, we're saying that that is what causes the shift in intelligence and the incentive structure for like the NSA government. So on your second contention about privacy, right? So why, if we are violating, I guess, like the Constitution in terms of free speech, why has this not been ruled like illegal in terms of the NSA intelligence?
Well, I'd say there's various different practices that go on in the US all of the time that all don't get brought to the Supreme Court and all don't have like a uniform ruling with those judges.
Right. I just feel like the reason as to why it's not being ruled illegal is because challenging free speech is okay so long as it like infringes on someone else's, someone else.
All right, I'll start. So as an overview, it'll just be down the negative case, starting with an overview. Start with an overview to the negative case. Realize that the negative is advocating for a continuation of the status quo. The Associated Press writes in a report published in 2020 that in 2019, there was the highest amount of anti-Black hate crimes in the history of the United States. This has a couple of implications. A, it proves that we have domestic surveillance right now, but we also simultaneously have huge amounts of hate crime against Black individuals around the United States. Proves empirically that surveillance doesn't work at fighting against hate crimes. But B, it also proves that it is the burden of the negative to quantify how much worse or how much worse this would get in the world of the affirmative. And particularly how many terrorist attacks have been stopped as a result of surveillance. And we would contend that this is not true and that surveillance is used actually disproportionately against communities of color. So they say in their MEMI evidence that we need to reject racism. We think that this is probably true. However, racism comes in a lot of different forms. For example, racism against people of Muslim faiths and Islamophobia, as well as racism against Black bodies. These should all be included in the discussion of what racism matters. And we would contend that surveillance on net hurt communities of color. With that said, though, let's go kind of down the details of the affirmative case. So the first overwhelming problem with the affirmative case is that right-wing terrorism that they define isn't defined by the federal government. In fact, right-wing terrorism, if you would note, is not defined as terrorism at all. This is a couple of implications. A, I'm not making a normative assessment as to whether or not that's good or bad. I'm just making an empirical observation, is that what's going to happen is that terrorist groups are not going to be surveilled by the FBI or the National Security Association. Instead, what's likely to happen is that surveillance is going to go against communities of color. In fact, UNEGBO explains in 2013 that historically surveillance programs have targeted civil rights activists historically. Specifically, if you look at the civil rights movement of the 1960s, Angela Davis, an advocate for civil rights, was labeled the #1 threat to national security by the FBI, or even Martin Luther King, where surveillance was used disproportionately against them. Historically, surveillance has been used against communities of color. Second, Pardon of Salon magazine explains in 2015 that in an incident in 2004, 10 peace activists were actually specifically rendered terrorist groups, even though they were handing out peanut butter and jelly sandwiches in protest of global imperialism and United States violence abroad. At that point, be very skeptical of their evidence, especially at the point in which terrorist attacks happen disproportionately. But perhaps more importantly, not only is there surveillance against communities of color, particularly Black communities, this also happens against Islamic communities. In fact, surveillance disproportionately targets Islamic communities, and it fuels this notion that all Islamic individuals are terrorists, and that's bad, and that's an independent reason why you should vote for the affirmative side, because racism in any form should be rejected. More specifically, though, if we delve down into the details, their late 14 evidence says is that surveillance specifically collects phone records. That identifies that they're never going to be able to solve back for the root cause of the problem, as if you look at instances of right-wing extremism or violence, like the Pizzagate scandal, that happened on instances of 4chan and like the dark web, right? Or even just like anonymous blogging posts. Collecting phone data isn't going to solve that problem, and you're dealing with an ideology. So if you're going to look to that, you should cross-apply our first contention about information overload, and how information overload allows, in ending the mass surveillance of data, allows freeing up resources so you can have people, anonymously posing themselves inside of these chat rooms so that they can actually solve terrorism better. So at the end of the day, you want to recognize that racism exists in America, and surveillance doesn't solve that. And eliminating surveillance isn't going to solve for racism if surveillance is what causes, at least partially, racism as it's experienced in society.
Okay, we'll stop there. I have like a minute 5 used. So it's going to be down the negative case and then down the affirmative case. Okay. Let's start off on this overview that they read that hate crime is going up right now. There's two problems here. The first one is that comparatively, we would argue that hate crime against minority groups would be higher if we did not have surveillance. This is because of the Brown evidence that we read in our uniqueness, which says that right now, it specifically talks about white supremacists as well, that the US has weathered higher rates of anti-Black violence back in the 1970s, which would be the comparative alternative. So the violence would have been a lot higher if we did not have surveillance. Next, they say that we don't quantify the amount of attacks that have happened. First, we do quantify it. We say 13 attacks have been stopped. But second, we say that specifically for anti-Black violence, any amount of attacks is important. We don't have to give you a specific 1 or 2 numbers. Then we both agree that all forms of racism should be evaluated. On our case specifically, the first argument they make is that right-wing groups are not defined as terrorists right now. 2 problems. First, our Lee evidence disproves this. Our Lee evidence says that there's been a shift away from focusing on Islamic terrorism and towards right-wing terrorism. The reason that this is important is because we would say that because swing states are becoming a lot more oriented towards the blue side, they have the ability to set policy decisions for the future, so they're more likely to focus on right-wing terrorism than Islamic terrorism. Second, our Brown evidence also says that there's been a reduction in terrorism overall, and it's about white supremacy. The next thing they say is that 10 peace activists were called terrorists, so there's a lot of problems with how we define terrorism. This is on net still better though, because we would say that even if 10 individuals were defined as terrorists, those people were not prosecuted or followed through as terrorists. Obviously, there's going to be some sort of mishap because the world is not perfect, but we say that on net, those issues would be a lot worse if we did not have the ability to narrow down the data and find the actual threats. The next thing they say is that Islamic surveillance happens right now. We tell you again from the Lee evidence that the shift has already occurred. Then the last thing they say is that phone records from the dark web can't be surveilled. Remember, the NSA is not the only organization that does surveillance. For example, the Department of Justice and the FBI also does surveillance. This is important though, because this also puts defense on their case. Even if the NSA reduces the amount of surveillance they do, other government organizations will still do surveillance. So their privacy arguments are untrue, and most of the other ones are as well. Let's go to their case. At the top of their terror argument, on the top level, you can turn the argument, because we would say that if the US reduces the amount of surveillance they're doing, they have to do something else to compensate for the reduction in terrorism. Leonard 14 explains that historically, the US has used lone wolf terrorist attacks to increase the amount of military deployments in other countries. This is because of the same warrant they give, that the US population thinks that Islamic terror is the real problem. So the government increases military adventurism in other countries. This is why Wood 12 quantifies that every 1,300 increase in troop deployments increases civilian casualties in these Middle Eastern countries 25%. Weigh this turn A on scope because it impacts multiple countries in the Middle East, and B as a link into racism because it's Islamophobic to go into Middle Eastern countries when the real threats are here at home. On their subpoint A about information, their evidence is outdated, and Gordon 20 finds that domestic terror is decreasing right now, and there's been a reduction in the amount of attacks. This is because Lewis finds that when we have more data, we have the ability to check back for the amount of threats that they are. Think about it like applying to college. If you only applied to college thinking there were 20 schools in the United States, you obviously wouldn't make the best decision if you have more schools at your choice. So obviously, it's a lot better to have more data to check back for the best solutions. On their subpoint B about the EU, their evidence is super outdated. Keeper 15 finds that the US initiates cooperation with other countries through surveillance diplomacy. And the Wall Street Journal from this month finds that the US and the EU have increased the amount of dependence for surveillance technology on terrorism financing. This means that right now there's cooperation. On their second contention about privacy, as Yukio points out, they don't prove a substantial impact to democracy because the only reason that free speech goes down is because we are using it to substitute some increase in security. This means that overall, there's not warrantless searches happening. There are searches happening to stop security issues from happening. Second response, though, is that they said that the NSA only stores data about the date and time of these calls. Obviously, that means that there's not a privacy violation happening. What K418 finds is that only 0.00004% of surveillance is actually intrusive. Make them prove that that is what triggers the impact of free speech going down and human rights going down. Finally, on the impact, we are a prerequisite to their privacy argument because HIMA 07 explains that if you don't have security, you don't have access to all other fundamental liberties and rights, which means that we are a prerequisite through terrorism.
All right, awesome. Are you ready for Crossfire?
Yeah.
So I'll start with the evidence you read at the top of the affirmative case. So the evidence talks about how a lone wolf terrorist attack increases military venturism. Is that what the argument is?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I guess a couple of clarifying questions. Does that mean then that you would need to prove that a terrorist attack would happen?
Yes.
Okay. So
we have to prove that a terrorist attack happens post a reduction in surveillance because
so what evidence do you read indicates that a terrorist attack is more likely to happen in a world post surveillance?
The link evidence that we read, let me see our Burkhardt evidence, or not Burkhardt evidence. Our Hines evidence says that a reduction in US surveillance makes it more difficult to track IP addresses, phone numbers, and find whether or not there is a plan.
What part of that evidence indicates that IP addresses and phone numbers are successful at deterring a terrorist attack? What makes that connection, I guess is my question. Because you're saying a terrorist attack increases military adventurism, and that evidence just says that surveillance collects IP addresses. What evidence do you have that links that to a terrorist attack? That IP collection leads to successful...
it says, quote, this ability to narrow down the location of terrorists can determine whether there's a domestic threat.
So what evidence does it say that that has been successful, or that...
The evidence we read at the bottom from the HDSL says that the NSA has prevented 13 terrorist attacks in the United States. Can I get a question?
Yeah.
Okay, sure. So let's talk about your privacy argument, right?
Sure.
So what evidence do you read that indicates, or how do we know that there has been an erosion of democracy over the past, since 2001, because that's when the NSA really ramped up surveillance?
Yeah, sure. So I definitely think that there, so you make this argument that there's other forms of surveillance. We would contend that the NSA surveillance program is the primary one. Like, think about the Edward Snowden whistleblower allegation. It was an international incident, and that was focused on NSA surveillance. And we also think that that specifically has been a huge collection of personal data. And even if there's other forms of surveillance, we would just make kind of more of a principle-based argument that any instance of violating privacy is not.
I don't think that answers my question. Is how do we know there's been an erosion of democracy? Like, how can we test that the status quo is bad for democracy?
Well, we would just make arguments that if the status quo is massively collecting data from unconsenting individuals, we just say that maybe there's not an empirical measurement on like democracy scales, but we would just say that that is principally against principles of democratic governance. I would like to ask a question now, if you don't mind.
Go for it.
So you keep mentioning this Brown evidence when you're frontlining your case.
Yeah.
And you cited in the rebuttal speech as anti-Black violence was higher in like the 1970s. But let me just read the quote from the card that you mentioned. So domestic terrorism could persist in the US for the foreseeable future. That's at least how you read it on case.
Yeah.
So if that is the case and domestic terrorism will continue, what is the indication that surveillance has actually been successful at fighting against white race?
So you read the first line, not the last line. The last line says, but the U.S. weathered these periods, and it's talking about, it says there was a surge of white supremacist terrorism in the 1950s and 1960s, but the U.S. weathered these periods thanks to effective U.S. intelligence and national security agencies.
Okay, thank you.
Is everyone ready? Okay, let's begin. You are voting for us on our first contention where we talk about an overload in data causing even more terrorism to go uncaught. My opponent's first response here is a turn where they talk about how if we decrease surveillance, we're going to increase military deployment. There's a lot of problems with this argument. Number one, during 9/11, we did both. These things are not a trade-off. Number two, after 9/11, there is so much less popular support for intervening abroad. We're not going to see this happening. Three, there's so many other considerations that go into a country's decision to invade or put troops in another country. With COVID, that's simply not going to happen. There's not enough money. There's not enough political will. We are going for our first argument where we talk about an overload in data causing problems in the system. Our Schneier evidence specifically says that that there has been absolutely no instances where we've been able to shut down terrorist organizations because the systems are simply flooded. My opponents give a couple of responses. Number one, they say there's been a decline in domestic terrorism. The problem with that is they don't respond to the Claiborne analysis in our impact, where we tell you that we spent $900 billion annually with no effect on decreasing terrorism. Second, my opponents say that more data is always good. The problem with this response is that they give absolutely no warrant for that analysis, whereas we tell you that when you have all of this data, it's impossible to mine through it, and it's impossible, therefore, to find any hints that could possibly lead to stopping a terrorist attack. The reason why you're voting on this argument is because we tell you that our side is one that is decreasing the amount of unnecessary and indiscriminate searches, which is thereby going to decrease the amount of data, enabling our law enforcement agencies to actually conduct less racist but also more accurate surveillance. But then you go to my opponent's case, a couple problems. Number one, start at the top. What we tell you according to the AP is that there's the highest levels of anti-Black violence we've ever seen in 2020. My opponents just say, oh, well, without surveillance, it would have been a lot worse. A lot of problems with this. Number one, they offer no warrant. Number two, their card is looking at the 1970s, where there was a lot of instances of anti-Black violence and surveillance from the government. We give you a lot of examples like Angela Davis and Martin Luther King. They never respond to that. Number two, what my opponents never respond to is the fact that their searches that they talk about in their case are mostly phone searches. They never respond to the fact that right-wing terrorist organizations use anonymous chat rooms like 4chan, and that means they're never actually going to catch the people that they say they are going to catch. Finally, what my opponents fail to recognize is that when you have more targeted surveillance, you're actually going to be more able to catch the right-wing terrorists that they talk about. But what is really problematic for my opponent's case is that they are entirely misconstruing the idea of anti-Black violence being solved by surveillance. We tell you no, anti-Black violence goes up because of surveillance. Specifically, we say that in the status quo, the government is using surveillance to predominantly surveil Black and brown communities. Even if there has been a paradigmatic shift away from Islamic communities, the anti-right terrorist organizations are not recognized as terrorist organizations by the U.S. government. They're never actually going to prioritize targeting them. And for these reasons, we urge you to affirm.
All right, awesome. We'll take some prep. Let's start on their argument about terrorism really quickly. They basically tell you the argument that without NSA surveillance, they're going to be able to increase the accuracy of surveillance by increasing a lot of officer stuff. We say that they literally give you no warrant by the next speech as the reason as to why they're going to be more accurate. They tell you that we don't give a warrant either in terms of our Lewis analysis, where we tell you it's actually going to be better in our world in terms of countering terrorism because we're going to be having more data. We do give a warrant. Our warrant is that the more data you have, the more accurate you're going to be in order to in terms of being able to find terrorist groups. They tell you that it's actually impossible to shift through a lot of the data, but that's not true insofar as we tell you that there's been literally 13 disruptions of terrorism within the past year alone. And remember the college analysis that we give you, where we tell you that the more data that you have available, the more likely that you are to actually be able to counter terrorism. We say that their solvency at the end of the day is very, very vague. We don't know what it looks like in terms of what they're actually going to be able to solve in terms of the terrorist efforts that they're talking about. But let's go to our argument about racism. We agree throughout the entire round that racism is going to be one of the most important impacts because of the effect that it gives to communities of color. They give you a couple of responses to our argument about surveillance being really good to counter right-wing terrorism. The first thing that they extend is this APA evidence that essentially says that right now we have high amounts of anti-Black violence in the status quo and that we're not doing any sort of solvencies. We contest this argument. We tell you that we do give a warrant as to why it's actually going to be comparatively worse, because we say that we are actually being successful in countering right-wing terrorism. But also we'd say that our Brown evidence literally says that Intel, in terms of Intel has been successful in curbing right-wing terrorism. terrorism. We'd also say that like historically, we have been able to curb all of the right-wing terrorism, which is why we see like lower rates than we would be comparatively seeing. The second thing they extend on this front is this argument about how phone searches are going to be like a reason as to why we're never going to be actually be successful in this kind of stuff. Again, remember that Brown evidence says that Intel's been able to be successful in this. But secondly, we'd say that phone searches are probably also going to count under NSA surveillance, because that's a way like a dark web like surveillance is always going to count under NSA surveillance, which means that in either world, we're going to be able to solve back for this kind of stuff. Why is this important? Because we say that the Lee evidence says that we are now targeting right-wing extremism in the status quo. And that's really important because we are shifting towards a trend of actually caring about right-wing terrorism. Sure, it may not be recognized in the status quo as terrorism, but not only are we acting towards it, we say in the long term, because swing states are shifting blue, which means that administrations are going to be turning more blue. In the long term, we're always going to be pursuing right-wing extremism as a form of terrorism in the long term. That's really important because Brown explicitly tells you that these terrorist threats are going to be continuing in the long term, and Forts tells you that without NSA surveillance, we are no longer going to be able to counter it because we are no longer able to get the monitoring to prevent and attack and identify these attacks. But also, even if you don't buy that they're like not able to like go into the dark web and go to do those kind of like surveillance, what our court's evidence also says that it is important to use NSA surveillance along with other forms of surveillance because it needs to work together to like rule out specific types of data, which means that NSA surveillance is always going to be important no matter what.
All right, cool. Are you all ready for Crossfire?
Mm-hmm.
Alyssa, do you want to ask the first question?
Yeah, sure. So can you all explain to me like why the fact that swing states are trending blue determines like what the government classifies as a terrorist organization versus not a terrorist organization?
That's because administrations turn more blue. So yeah, maybe under a Trump administration, we're like, hey, terrorism, right-wing terrorism isn't terrorism. But as administrations turn more blue, they're able to put more effective NSA people within like.
So real quickly with that question, as a follow-up, why didn't Obama classify right-wing groups as terrorist organizations? And like, why did Obama continue, I guess, the war on terror and through like the usage of drone strikes on the Middle East? Why is a Democratic president necessarily?
Our argument, so our Lee evidence is from 2015, which is the last year of the Obama administration. We say the shift happened post that time. And the reason that it was like, it wasn't like your AP evidence also is probably a reason why, because now there's a shift towards, more blue policy. And I think that's indicative of the fact that swing states have flipped now, and like racism was a like really domestic policy topic in the last election.
Yeah,
so the shift is
sure.
happening.
I also just think that. Oh no, go ahead.
Yeah. So just to clarify, so you're saying that like your argument is like this is the trend, not like this is going to happen.
Well, it is happening. I don't think. Sure. I don't think what we define as terrorism is indicative of the successfulness of the United States in terms of countering right-wing terrorism. We tell you explicitly that we are pursuing it through the Lee evidence, even if we might not like classify it as terrorism, right? So under the NSA, we are still countering the right-wing extremism.
Is it cool if we ask you guys a question?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so let's talk about your information argument. So what is the reason why less information helps us find terrorists better? And like specifically less information on U.S. citizens.
Yeah, I'll explain that. So, so having more resources by the NSA, they could do things instead of surveillance, like going on to anonymous chat rooms. Like they could create anonymous accounts.
That is not in your world because that is gathering data.
Yeah, and
that's not gathering data though.
Yeah, it is. It's going.
That's an undercover operation.
Like undercover. It's like covering data is like, oh, I logged your phone conversation or whatever.
Right.
This instead is like having an undercover agent.
Our argument is
we're saying stuff like
terrorism, that. Right? So like, how does that stop right-wing terror? Because you can't surveil on U.S. citizens anymore.
Yeah, so it wouldn't be, that's not surveillance though. That's like having an undercover like police officer or something like that. Like it's surveillance is when you're collecting information. Let's say you and Yukio were having a conversation, it's collecting that information. But if I'm posing as
so you're saying that right now there is no surveillance on the dark web.
So you're saying that
our argument is just that there's indiscriminate surveillance. So we're saying like there can still be search warrants, there can still be other things like that, but we're saying the indiscriminate nature of the surveillance under the NSA is what makes it hard to actually catch terrorists.
All right, so if everybody's ready, I'll begin. The most important argument in the round is our argument about information overload. Our Schneier evidence is very specific, and it answers back a lot of the claims that they're making, is that more data is always worse, because what happens is that you flood the system with false positives, and that the government indiscriminately surveils against millions of people, which is why empirically it has cost $900 billion with no measurable decrease in things like anti-Black violence, right? They've had more than 2 decades of time to prove how it's been effective, and anti-Black violence is at an all-time high, which means you should be incredibly skeptical of their argument that ending surveillance is going to solve the problem. Instead, our argument is simple, is that by ending surveillance, you allow law enforcement agencies to invest in more effective strategies at solving against fighting terrorism and other terrorist organizations. On the negative case, however, there's a lot of problems. The first of which is you should be, again, skeptical of their claims that the government is all of a sudden going to become a progressive tool. Their argument about swing states probably ignores historical precedent of democratic governments that specifically continue anti-Black policies, and why historically in the 1960s, surveillance was used against Angela Davis, Martin Luther King, and even the Black Panther Party. There's no reason why that's not going to continue. They also keep relying upon this Brown evidence, but their Brown evidence isn't specific to right-wing surveillance. It's just specific to terrorism or to surveillance more generally. We would say that only facilitates more racism, particularly against Black and Brown communities. Also, repeatedly, myself and Alyssa have made arguments throughout this debate, is that their type of surveillance doesn't work. The evidence they read says collecting phone data. We say that the majority of right-wing terrorism happens as a result of anonymous chat rooms such as 4chan. They have not once responded to that argument throughout the debate, and how specifically ending mass surveillance would free resources to policymakers to go into these chat rooms and actually solve back for the root cause of anti-Black violence. So at the end of the day, you should take a step back and look at it from the bigger picture. Surveillance exists, so do hate crimes. You should be skeptical of the claim that getting rid of surveillance is going to be a panacea to a litany of the problems that plague American society.
So I'm gonna, it's not really gonna be a roadmap. It's just gonna be like voters. So, all right. Let's start with how you should view the round. Remember our Brown evidence that we read. We say that if something is not broken, do not fix it. Our Brown evidence is so much better than every piece of evidence they read in the round. It specifically says that in the 1960s and 1970s, the rise of white supremacy caused a lot of anti-Black violence, and the US has now weathered these periods due to intel gathering by the NSA. They say that our evidence is not specific to right-wing groups. Yes, it is. The next thing they extend is that this idea that right-wing terror is going to, that we're going to flood the system with data. Again, remember, our evidence is much better than theirs is. We say that the intel gathering right now has suppressed the amount of terrorism that's happening, and you can prove that that's true because our evidence says that 13 attacks have been stopped. The last thing they extend is this idea that NSA surveillance is not good because there's chat rooms. Remember what UQ extends at the very end of her last speech. She says that the NSA surveillance is key to all surveillance because we lead the other parts of the government towards finding domestic terrorists. You cannot just have the FBI surveilling and then ignore all the other industries. So how does this implicate in the round? We tell you from our Lee evidence that after 2015, there's been a shift towards the focus on right-wing terrorism. They say we ignore past precedent. No, our evidence is from 2015, which was the end of the Obama administration, indicating that when Democratic presidents, as of right now, as of 2015, were in power, they shifted their focus towards right-wing terrorism. And because states are becoming more blue, that policy focus is going further. Remember, if something is not broken, do not fix it. We say that right now, there's a shift happening and it's a lot better. We tell you that having more data is better than less data. Remember what I said in rebuttal. If you could only apply to college thinking that there were 20 schools in the US, you would obviously make a bad decision. But if you have multiple schools, hundreds of thousands of schools, then you make a better decision overall. Why does this matter? Because we say that when you reduce the amount of data available, you are not able to target the amount of terrorists that you need even better. Even more so, we say that most of these right-wing terrorists are US citizens, which is why wiretapping and all that stuff is important. This is key for anti-Black violence because right-wing extremist groups are the biggest threat towards committing anti-Black violence. Protect those who can protect themselves and negate.